Picture this. A young woman's trembling hand holds a quill pen over a document that will change the course of history forever. She's 18 years old, standing in the most luxurious palace in Europe, surrounded by advisors whispering sweet promises of power. But this single signature she's about to make will ignite the most dangerous game of chess between two queens that the world has ever seen. A game where the prize isn't just a crown, but the very soul of England itself. This isn't just another tale of royal drama or political intrigue. This is the story of how one moment of youthful ambition created a rivalry so intense, so personal, so devastating that it would consume two extraordinary women for nearly 3 decades. It's the story of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, and how her desperate quest for power led to one of history's most tragic endings. What makes this story absolutely mesmerizing isn't the castles or the crowns or even the political schemes. It's the deeply human story of two women who should have been allies, perhaps even friends, but instead became each other's greatest nightmare. It's about how a teenage girl's signature on a piece of paper would eventually cost her everything she held dear, including her life. The year is 1558. And in the glittering halls of the French court, something extraordinary is happening. Young Mary Stuart, already Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old, is being encouraged to do something that seems almost innocent at first glance. Her French father-in-law, King Henry II, suggests she should style herself not just as Queen of Scotland, but as Queen of England and Ireland as well. To a 16-year-old girl surrounded by flattering courtiers, this probably seemed like a wonderful idea. After all, didn't she have royal blood? Wasn't she the great-granddaughter of Henry VII? In the eyes of Catholic Europe, wasn't she more legitimate than Elizabeth Tudor, who many considered illegitimate? But what Mary couldn't possibly understand at 16 was that this decision would mark her for death. Let me paint you a picture of who Mary really was at this moment. Imagine the most accomplished young woman you've ever met, then multiply that by 10. Mary spoke 6 languages fluently. She could compose poetry that made grown men weep, play musical instruments that would silence entire courts, and dance with such grace that ambassadors would write home about her elegance. She was nearly 6 feet tall in an age when most women barely reached 5 feet, with striking auburn hair that caught the light like spun gold, and eyes that contemporaries described as capable of commanding armies with a single glance. More importantly, she had been raised to believe she was destined for greatness. From the moment she arrived in France as a 5-year-old refugee fleeing English armies, she had been treated not just as a queen, but as the future queen of multiple kingdoms. The French court had invested everything in making her the perfect royal bride, the ultimate political weapon disguised as a beautiful young woman. So when she signed that document claiming the English throne, she thought she was simply asserting her rightful heritage. She had no idea she had just declared war on her own cousin. Elizabeth Tudor, meanwhile, was fighting for her very survival as the new Queen of England. She had spent her entire life being declared legitimate, then illegitimate, then legitimate again as her father Henry VIII's political needs changed. She had watched her half-sister Mary Tudor burn hundreds of Protestants alive, had lived through coups and conspiracies, had seen how quickly royal fortunes could change. Just as she was beginning to feel secure on her throne, this beautiful young cousin across the channel was publicly claiming that Elizabeth had no right to be there at all. You have to understand the psychological impact this had on Elizabeth. Imagine finally achieving something you fought for your entire life, only to have someone announce to the entire world that you're a fraud. That's exactly what Mary's claim felt like to Elizabeth. It wasn't just political posturing, it was a personal attack on everything Elizabeth had endured to reach the throne. But here's where this story becomes truly heartbreaking. Mary probably didn't fully grasp what she had done. She was a teenager in love, newly married to the French Prince Francis, surrounded by advisors who saw her as a chess piece in their own games of power. The decision to claim the English throne wasn't really hers, but she would spend the rest of her life paying the ultimate price for it. And before I continue with this incredible story, if you're as fascinated as I am by these hidden human dramas behind history's greatest moments, I'd truly appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. There's something magical about sharing these intimate glimpses into the past with viewers from around the world, all of us connected by our curiosity about the real people behind the crown jewels and palace walls. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because this is where Mary's story becomes both a love story and a tragedy rolled into one. Just as everything seemed perfect for the young queen, fate delivered the first of many devastating blows. Her husband, Francis, who had become King of France, died suddenly in 1560. He was only 16 years old, and Mary, at 18, found herself a widow in a foreign court where her position was suddenly very uncertain. She could have stayed in France. She had suitors among the French nobility who would have given her a comfortable, safe life. She could have married the Duke of Nemours and lived in elegant obscurity, enjoying poetry and music and all the cultural refinements she loved. Instead, she made a decision that would ultimately destroy her. She decided to return to Scotland and rule her kingdom in person. This choice reveals something crucial about Mary's character. Even though being raised in luxury, despite having every reason to choose safety over responsibility, she felt a genuine duty to her Scottish subjects. She wanted to be a real queen, not just a figurehead. This wasn't mere ambition. It was a sense of purpose that would drive both her greatest achievements and her ultimate downfall. The Scotland Mary returned to in 1561 was nothing like the France she was leaving. Where the French court was sophisticated and refined, Scotland was rough and practical. Where French nobles engaged in elegant verbal sparring, Scottish lords settled disputes with swords. Where religious tolerance was possible in France, Scotland was torn between Catholic and Protestant factions that genuinely hated each other. But Mary was determined to succeed. She showed remarkable political intelligence in those early years, agreeing to maintain Protestant worship as the official religion while hearing Mass privately in her own chapel. She worked to modernize Scotland's legal system and strengthen its economy. For a few brief years, it actually seemed like she might pull off the impossible, being a Catholic queen ruling a Protestant nation successfully. Then came the decision that would destroy everything: her choice of a husband. Marriage wasn't just personal for a queen. It was the most important political decision she would ever make. Elizabeth of England urged Mary to marry Robert Dudley, which would have created a strong alliance between their kingdoms. Foreign princes offered marriages that would have strengthened Scotland's international position without threatening its independence. Mary had options that could have secured her throne and her future. Instead, she chose Henry, Stuart, Darnley, and this choice would prove to be catastrophic beyond her wildest nightmares. On paper, Darnley seemed perfect. He was tall, handsome, cultured, and he had royal blood through his descent from Margaret Tudor. Their marriage would combine two claims to the English throne, potentially strengthening Mary's position. But Darnley had a fatal character flaw. He was vain, violent, and completely unsuited for any real responsibility. The marriage became a nightmare almost immediately. Darnley demanded to be made king, not just prince consort. He wanted equal authority in governing Scotland. When Mary refused, he began drinking heavily and consorting with her enemies among the Scottish nobility. Worst of all, he became insanely jealous of David Rizzio, Mary's Italian secretary and advisor. What happened next was so shocking that it traumatized everyone who witnessed it, including Mary herself. On March 9, 1566, Darnley and a group of conspirators burst into Mary's private chambers while she was dining with Rizzio and several other courtiers. They dragged the secretary away and murdered him brutally, stabbing him over 50 times while Mary, 6 months pregnant, was forced to watch in horror. But here's where Mary's true strength showed itself. Despite being traumatized and heavily pregnant, despite being essentially held prisoner by her own husband and his allies, she managed to convince Darnley that she forgave him. Then, just hours later, she escaped in the darkness and rode through the night to safety, rallying loyal supporters and returning in triumph to Edinburgh. 3 months later, she gave birth to her son James, securing the succession and proving her resilience in the face of unimaginable stress. But her marriage to Darnley was finished. She couldn't live with him as a husband, but she couldn't easily divorce him without compromising her son's legitimacy and giving ammunition to her enemies. For months, Mary tried to find a solution to this impossible situation. Darnley was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous, but he was also the father of her heir. She began spending time away from court, ostensibly for her health, but really to avoid her unstable husband. Then, in February 1567, Darnley was found dead under mysterious circumstances at a house in Edinburgh. The official story was that he had been killed in an explosion, but his body showed clear signs of strangulation. Someone had murdered the husband of a reigning queen, and suspicion immediately fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, one of Mary's most powerful supporters. What Mary did next would seal her fate forever. 3 months after Darnley's death, she married Bothwell in a ceremony that shocked all of Europe. Whether she was in love with Bothwell, whether she was forced into the marriage, whether she had been involved in planning Darnley's murder, these questions have puzzled historians for over 4 centuries. But the perception of guilt was enough to destroy her completely. The Scottish nobles rose in rebellion, accusing their queen of adultery and murder. At the Battle of Carberry Hill, Mary's army faced the rebel forces, but as the standoff continued, her supporters gradually melted away. Faced with civil war or surrender, Mary chose surrender, believing she could negotiate her way back to power. It was a decision that showed both her political naivete and her genuine love for her country. She didn't want Scotland torn apart by war, even if it meant sacrificing her own position. The rebels forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son and imprisoned her on an island castle in the middle of a Scottish loch. But Mary wasn't finished yet. In one of the most romantic and daring escapes in royal history, she charmed one of her guards into helping her flee across the loch in a small boat. Within days, she had raised another army of supporters who still believed in her innocence and her right to rule. The final battle came at Longside, and it was Mary's last chance to reclaim her throne by force. Watching from a hilltop as her army collapsed in defeat, Mary realized that her reign in Scotland was truly over. She had a choice: flee to France, where she might live safely in exile, or seek refuge with her cousin Elizabeth in England. She chose England, and this decision would prove to be her final and most fatal mistake. Mary expected Elizabeth to help her reclaim her throne. She believed that one anointed queen would naturally support another against rebellious subjects. Instead, she found herself a comfortable prisoner, moved from castle to castle, but never truly free. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. She couldn't send Mary back to Scotland where she might be executed. She couldn't support Mary's restoration without angering the Protestant Scottish lords who were England's allies. Most dangerously, she couldn't set Mary free because the Catholic queen remained a symbol of hope for every conspiracy against Elizabeth's rule. For 19 years, Mary lived in this strange limbo. She was given fine quarters, good food, elegant clothes, and a small court of servants, but she was always under guard and never allowed to forget that her life depended entirely on Elizabeth's mercy. During this time, she became the center of numerous Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth and place her on the English throne. What makes this period so heartbreaking is seeing how it transformed Mary. The vibrant young woman who had once danced at the French court became a middle-aged prisoner whose auburn hair turned gray and whose health declined under the stress of captivity. Yet she never stopped hoping for rescue, never stopped believing that she would one day reclaim her freedom and her crowns. The relationship between Mary and Elizabeth during these years was deeply complex and surprisingly personal. They never met face to face, despite Mary's desperate pleas for a personal audience, but they maintained an extensive correspondence that reveals two women who understood each other perhaps better than anyone else could. Elizabeth was genuinely torn between her duty to protect England and her sympathy for Mary as a fellow woman trying to rule in a man's world. Mary alternated between gratitude for Elizabeth's protection and frustration at her continued captivity. In her letters, she appealed to Elizabeth as a queen, as a cousin, and as a woman, using every possible argument to secure her freedom. But Elizabeth couldn't take that risk. Every intelligence report confirmed that Mary remained a magnet for Catholic conspirators and foreign invasion plans. As long as Mary lived, Elizabeth would never be truly secure on her throne. Both women were trapped by forces beyond their control. Elizabeth knew that executing Mary would set a dangerous precedent and might provoke Catholic Europe to unite against England. Mary knew that her best hope lay in Elizabeth's continued mercy, but she couldn't resist the plots that promised to restore her to power. The end came with the Babington Plot of 1586, a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne with Spanish support. What the conspirators didn't know was that their correspondence with Mary was being intercepted and decoded by Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's master spy. Mary's participation in this conspiracy, proven by her own letters, finally gave Elizabeth the legal justification to order her cousin's trial and execution. Even then, Elizabeth hesitated for months, desperately seeking some alternative to killing a fellow queen. But the political pressure was overwhelming, and in February 1587, Mary was finally executed at Fotheringhay Castle. Even in death, she maintained her dignity and her claim to innocence, becoming a martyr whose story would inspire Catholics for centuries to come. The ultimate irony is that Mary's son, James, raised as a Protestant in Scotland, eventually inherited both the Scottish and English thrones when Elizabeth died childless in 1603, uniting the kingdoms her mother had died trying to rule. Looking back on Mary's extraordinary life, it's impossible not to see it as a tragedy of missed opportunities and fatal miscalculations. If she had never claimed the English throne, if she had chosen different husbands, if she had accepted exile in France instead of seeking refuge in England, her story might have had a completely different ending. But perhaps that's missing the point. Mary's story isn't really about political success or failure. It's about a woman who refused to compromise her sense of who she was meant to be, even when that refusal cost her everything. She could have chosen safety over responsibility, comfort over duty, but she always chose to fight for what she believed was rightfully hers. The rivalry between Mary and Elizabeth reveals the impossible position of women rulers in the 16th century. They had to be strong enough to command respect, but not so strong as to threaten male authority. They had to marry for political advantage, but maintain reputations for virtue. They had to produce heirs, but not at the cost of their political effectiveness. Elizabeth solved these contradictions by never marrying, maintaining her independence at the cost of leaving the succession uncertain. Mary tried to have it all: marriage, motherhood, and absolute power, and the attempt destroyed her. Today, more than 4 centuries later, Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of history's most fascinating figures, precisely because her story speaks to universal human themes that transcend historical context. Her rivalry with Elizabeth shows us how family relationships can be poisoned by political competition, how good intentions can lead to catastrophic outcomes, and how the pursuit of what we believe we deserve can consume everything else in our lives. Mary's tragedy wasn't that she failed, but that she failed so completely while maintaining her dignity and her convictions until the very end. Her story reminds us that even queens are human, subject to the same emotions, mistakes, and fatal flaws that affect us all. The only difference is that when queens make mistakes, the consequences can reshape the destiny of nations and echo through centuries. In the end, Mary, Queen of Scots, gave us something more valuable than a successful reign. She gave us a story that reveals the very human heart beating beneath the crown, the woman behind the queen, and the eternal truth that sometimes the price of being true to ourselves is higher than we ever imagined we'd have to pay.